Welcome to this live session from Gies College of Business at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Please make sure your microphone is muted, your video camera is turned on, and you are ready to engage with your instructors, classmates, and colleagues.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our very first live session for ACCI 505 Part A. So, it's pretty early. Let's go ahead and get into it. My name is Matthew Hutchins, and I will be your lead instructor over the course of the next 8 weeks, and probably for most of you, over the course of the next 16 weeks, if you stick around for Part B. My partner in taxation this semester is going to be Margaret Evans. Some of you may recognize her from a prior course. Margaret, how are you doing this morning?
Good morning, Matt. I'm doing very well. Excited to be here. Happy for the start of ACCI 505 and welcome to everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces from previous semesters and previous courses, and some I just met yesterday in 501. So this is going to be a great class and a great semester.
Yes, I certainly hope so. I will say this is the earliest that I have ever taught an online class, 8:30 in the morning, at least 8:30 in the morning Champaign time. Maybe it's a little bit earlier for some of you guys out there. So hopefully I'm well caffeinated enough and we'll be able to make this as enjoyable as possible. And because we're teaching tax, it's really pretty easy for us since tax is so interesting to begin with. So what the heck are we going to be doing today? Here's the agenda. We're going to do a little bit of introduction. We're going to talk about why taxes are so cool. We're then going to talk about the syllabus because it's the first day of class. We have to devote some time to talking about the syllabus. Make sure we understand what is going to be required of you during this course, how to do well, where to go to get help, what stuff you need to get, what stuff you need to complete. And then with our time remaining, we will wade in to a little bit of that Module 1 material. I will say right off the bat, Module 1 is a very dense module. It's probably denser than most other modules that we're going to encounter, at least for the first 8 weeks. So if you go through Module 1 and you're like, this is a lot of stuff, don't worry. It gets easier. It gets less dense. And it gets less dense, I'd say, starting next week. Because in Module 1, we got a lot of readings. Because we have to understand the federal tax system. We got to understand all those legal authorities. It's a little bit like a mini law school boot camp to understand the tax code and all of its supporting guidance. But trust me, Module 2, reading assignments are light. There is sort of this pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, if you will. So that's the agenda for today. Let's go ahead and start off with some of this introductory syllabus type stuff. So if you guys need help, if it's of a technical nature, if it's related to Coursera, if it's not content related, if it's technical related, if for some reason something isn't working right technically in Coursera or Canvas, for that you can email isupport@illinois.edu. Now, for a lot of these issues that appear to be technical, it's really something that either Margaret or I would be able to fix. So even though you email iSupport, make sure that you copy Margaret or I on the email as well, because oftentimes we can help you out pretty quickly. If you have issues that are related to grading or they're of a personal nature, then you just want to contact Margaret or myself directly. Just email us directly. Don't email iSupport generally for things of that nature. And of course, if you have content questions, if you have questions about how taxes work, about something that we've actually talked about or learned about in one of our videos or live sessions, for that, there's a few different places you can go. I would say the best place to go if you have a content question would be to the class Q&A form. Because when you post in the discussion board, not only do you get a response to your question, but the whole class can see your question. They may have had similar questions, and then they can see the response as well. But if you don't want to do the Q&A form, you can always just email myself or Margaret directly. Although I will say, if you email us a really good question, we may anonymously post it to the discussion board anyway, because we think it's something that your classmates may benefit from seeing. Now, as we're going through this introductory material stuff, Margaret, if you have anything you want to say or just chime in, interrupt me. But before we get going, before we tell you a little bit about Margaret and I, we want to know a little bit about you guys. So we're getting ready to take an introductory course in federal taxation. There is no prior knowledge required to take this course. We don't expect you to know anything. We're going to teach you everything that you need to know. But it's possible that some of you may have came into this class with a little bit of prior tax knowledge. Perhaps you file your own tax returns. Perhaps you work in a tax group, either at a private company or public accounting. So we're going to jump in with our first polling question. Polling question number 1 for the course. My current level of tax knowledge or experience is A, little to none, B, basic, C, intermediate, or D, advanced. And while you guys are taking that poll, I see we got a question in the chat. How do we access the Q&A form? So the Q&A form is in Canvas. So we're just using Canvas for our discussion board. So if you look at the sort of left-hand navigation, there should be something that says discussions or discussion board. I'm not exactly sure how it's termed, but if you click on that, then it'll open up the discussion board and you'll see we have a discussion for week 0, for week 1, for week 2. We'll have discussions for once we get the group project started, tax return project, etc. All right, Margaret, how do the results look?
They look really good. We have about 89% answering, and most people are really saying they have a basic knowledge at this point. I think filing your own income taxes kind of helps out.
Yeah, so we can go ahead and in that poll, share it so the class can see what their classmates have going on. Looks like we got a lot of basics, a few intermediates, no advanced, which is maybe good news for Margaret and I. But we got a nice mix. But of course, you don't have to know anything coming into this class. We don't expect you to know anything. We'll teach you everything you need to know. So what is much more important to Margaret and I than what you know now is how excited about taxes you are now. So polling question number 2, my current level of excitement about tax. Is it none? You're only here because this is a required course. Is it low? Maybe we could get you to love taxes. Maybe it's sometimes interesting. Maybe you have medium. You're not sure. You're open to tax as a future, or maybe you already love tax. Maybe you've already determined this is the career for you, or maybe if it's not the career for you, it's just a topic you find extremely interesting. And of course, these results are all anonymous. If you select none, we're not going to track you down between live sessions, send you emails, ask you, why are you not more excited? But Margaret, what do we got for this poll?
Well, we're looking at 92%, so I think we're in good and we can close it. We've got a lot of people with high enthusiasm, which is great because this is a wonderful class. Matt has put a lot of work into it and made it a very interesting course with a lot of fun things about tax. So I'm pretty sure by the end of it, you'll really love tax.
Yeah, well, let's not oversell things. And it's good that we have high enthusiasm right off the bat, although maybe not so good for Margaret and I, because, in order to keep that high enthusiasm up, we're going to have to work extra hard. But I think we may be up for the challenge. So what exactly are we going to be doing in this course? What are we going to be learning about? We're going to be learning about the tax system of the United States, and only the United States. And we're going to be talking about the tax system at a federal level. So we're talking about the federal government. We're not concerned with how state and local governments impose taxation. We're just thinking about federal taxes. And even within the federal tax system, we are primarily only focused in on one type of federal tax. And at least for Part A, we're going to be focusing on the federal individual income tax. In Part B, we might dabble a little bit into the corporate income tax. And of course, there are other taxes that are closely associated with the income tax that we might talk about as well, like payroll taxes, self-employment taxes, which are so close they're actually on the same Form 1040. So we're going to be talking about income taxes. We're not going to be talking about other federal taxes like excise taxes or tariffs or anything of that nature. We are focused on income taxes. So some of the things that we're going to learn this 8 weeks is what is and is not taxable, because we're going to be talking about income taxes. So we need to know, well, first off, what is income and what isn't income? And then, is that income taxable? Is it included on your return? Do you have to pay tax on it? Or is it a type of income that is not taxable? Perhaps it is excluded or exempted from the federal tax system. And also, when it comes to income tax, what is just as important as whether or not something is taxable is when is something going to be taxable. Because in the United States, we have annual accounting periods for our taxes. Generally, for an individual, we're looking at calendar year. So you might say your 2023 tax year, your 2024 tax year. A big issue when it comes to income tax is when is something going to be taxable? Or if you're talking about deductions, of course, whether or not something is deductible is a big issue, but when is it going to be deductible? Is something income or a deduction in year one? Is something income or a deduction in year two? And then once we have those, is it gross income? Is it not? Is it deductible? Is it not? Is it year one? Is it year two? Once we have all that figured out, then we'll do some actual calculating the tax. And at the end of our 8 weeks together, we'll actually complete a basic Form 1040 together with a hypothetical client. So if you've done your own Form 1040 in the past, it may look somewhat familiar to you, although maybe we'll have a few quirks and side quests the tax return will have that you can enjoy. If you haven't done your Form 1040, it'll be good practice, and then maybe in the future, you can start doing your own tax return. So just to give you an idea, you're at the very start of the tax path as part of the IMSA program. And just to give you an idea of all the different tax classes that you could take over your IMSA career, we start off where we're at right now with ACCI 505 Part A. And this 8 weeks primarily focused in on the individual income tax and a whole bunch of introductory concepts that are broadly applicable to all different tax types. So for example, in Module 1, we're learning some basic foundational principles like what is a tax? What is the tax base? What are tax rates? And we're learning things like where does the tax law of the United States come from? Well, it starts with the Constitution, then it goes to the Internal Revenue Code, and of course we have interpreting guidance from the Department of Treasury and the courts. And that is broadly applicable to all tax types, not just individual income tax. And you'll see that a lot of the individual income tax topics that we talk about, even though we're going to be learning about them in the context of an individual, they are broadly applicable to business entities, for example. So whether or not something is deductible, generally the rules are going to be the same, whether it's an individual running their sole proprietorship, whether it's a large corporation. Of course, there are some differences, but as a general rule, it's going to be pretty similar. For our second 8 weeks together, ACCI 505 Part B, we're going to be talking about property transactions. So here, we're going to be talking about, well, I have a business and I've acquired some property as part of that business operation. Maybe I've bought a new factory. Maybe I've acquired some land. Maybe I bought a machine. Maybe I bought an automobile for that business. How do I treat the costs that I incurred for that piece of equipment or machinery or land? And then we'll also talk about things like, well, what about when I later on sell that piece of property? Or what if I just have investment property? What if I'm buying and selling stocks? And then we'll talk a little bit about creation and basics of the various business entities in Part B. Now, Margaret, you, I think, have taught 507 for quite a few years. Can you give us a little bit of a taste of what 507 entails? So if you take 505, which of course is required for the IMSA degree, you may decide that tax is so fun, so exciting, you want to continue on and take the elective 507. What can you expect in 507, Margaret?
Well, in 507, we build on all the property transaction information you'll learn in 505 Part B. And we go into corporate taxation much more deeply than we do in Part B of 505. And then in Part B of 507, we go into pass-through entities. So things like partnerships, S corporations, LLCs, and get into that fairly deeply, just to kind of give you a good broad overview of them. So that course I highly recommend as well. And then I know Matt's got the other two courses he teaches, the multi-state taxation and interstate, or what is the other one? I can't see it from here.
International. So
National. Thank you.
So the 505 required class, basic tax knowledge. 507, you get more of that business entity stuff. If you're just wanting to take the CPA exam, if you're wanting to pass reg, and of course we got the new tax section, TCP, probably all you need for CPA exam prep is 505, and I'd highly recommend 507 because a huge portion of reg is tax, including some of this business entity stuff. And a lot of the stuff in 507 is also in the TCP exam, which if you don't really know the CPA exam section names, don't worry about it. It's all brand new anyway, starting in January 24. But from perspective of CPA exam prep, highly recommend 507, even though it's optional. The other two classes, 550 and 554, which I do teach. I don't teach 507. Professor Michael Donahoe teaches 507, who is the head of the Department of Accountancy here at Illinois, which makes him my boss. Great instructor, great course. But if you really, really like tax and you just want more tax courses that are going to give you more knowledge, more skills, but maybe aren't going to be so helpful in the CPA exam because multi-state and international are so lightly tested on the CPA exam. We do have a couple of 4-week courses. They're condensed. They're in the summer. They're 4 weeks, 2 credits. Normally it'd be 8 weeks, but we sort of cram it into 4 weeks, where we have multi-state taxation, where you learn about how state and local governments impose taxes on cross-border transactions, and then ACCI 554, where we talk about how the United States imposes taxation on cross-border transactions, except here, instead of working across state lines, we're working across international borders. So lots of options. If you want more tax, plenty of opportunity for that. So we're focused in on the federal income tax. So let's ask ourselves a few questions just about taxes to get us into the right mood. So question 1, who pays taxes? And this can be any kind of tax, doesn't have to be a federal tax. Margaret, it's pretty early in the morning, so maybe you haven't paid any taxes yet today. But have you paid any taxes in the last couple of days?
Well, yes, I'm actually staying in a hotel, so I'm paying taxes today. And I also went out for dinner last night, so I paid taxes for that as well.
All right, so probably definitely you got some, local sales taxes, some excise taxes on the hotel room. I guess the gist is everybody pays taxes, and everyone pays taxes probably almost every day they go out and do something in the world. Now, what about federal taxes? So it doesn't sound like you paid any federal taxes when you went out to dinner or when you stayed at the hotel. At least you didn't pay any federal taxes directly. But have you paid any federal taxes lately, Margaret?
Let me think. It's been a little while. Partly because I'm in Canada, so I'm paying more international at the moment.
Oh my goodness, you're teaching a U.S. federal tax class and you're in Canada. Oh my goodness, but we'll allow it. But for federal taxes, there's still federal excise taxes, maybe when you go buy a gallon of gasoline. And of course, every time you get paid, there's all kinds of stuff that gets taken out of your pay. You have income tax that's been withheld, you have payroll taxes that have been withheld. So lots of people pay federal taxes. Now, what about this last question, Margaret? Who pays federal income taxes. Well, here, the United States, we have a real mass tax system where millions and millions upon millions of taxpayers are paying federal income taxes. And even those whose income may be too low to owe federal income taxes, they're still filing federal income tax returns because for the last at least 30 years, maybe even going as far back as the Nixon administration, the United States has made this effort to shift our social welfare system, our social safety net, from separate organizations that administer benefits to operating as part of the tax code. So we have these social safety net programs. Most of them are based on work requirements, which is why they have bipartisan support, like the Earned Income Tax Credit or the Additional Child Tax Credit, the refundable portion of the Child Tax Credit. So even taxpayers that don't have enough money to owe federal income tax are part of the tax system. So I think if we look at the next slide here, in fiscal year 2022, there were about 161 million individual tax returns that were filed with the IRS. And what makes this number even bigger is recognizing that a lot of those 161 million tax returns were joint tax returns, where a married couple, a husband and their spouse or a wife and their spouse, filed a single return for two taxpayers. So lots of people in the federal income tax system, whether you're an uber wealthy, high income individual, or whether you're a family that relies on these types of social safety net refundable credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit. So very broadly applicable. So taxes, they impact everyone. So by its very nature, it's going to be very practical knowledge. So that's why taking a tax class is such a good idea, in addition to the fact that it's required for your degree. There's also implications for economics, society, politics. I mean, tax policy is a pretty big driver of the economy, of the political spectrum. I mean, if you open up the Wall Street Journal, you're pretty likely to see on the front page, most days of the week perhaps, or at least once a week, an article that talks about tax policy. What is Congress doing? What is Congress considering to do? What is a candidate for elected office? What are they proposing in regards to taxation? So taxes, big driver in terms of our society, in terms of the economy, and for politics. And I think taxes are great as a career option. And one of the reasons that tax is so great as a career option is that since around the end of 2017, there has just been an avalanche of massive tax law changes that have required skilled professionals to advise their clients and help their clients on how to navigate these types of massive changes. And it all started probably at the end of 2017 with the legislation commonly known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But on top of that, we had huge tax provisions that were enacted during the COVID-19 pandemic as part of something known as the CARES Act. We had a big tax package known as the American Rescue Plan. We had the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, which had some tax angles. And then we had the American Rescue Plan. And then we had the Inflation Reduction Act. All of these big pieces of legislation had big tax effects. And what makes it even more exciting is that the big piece of tax legislation that started it all at the end of 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, big chunks of the changes made to how individuals are taxed are expiring or sunsetting at the end of 2025. So there's going to be big changes if Congress does nothing. If Congress does something, well, there's probably going to be big changes anyway. So more potential for trusted tax advisors to be needed in the very near future. And of course, we already talked about how helpful this class is going to be for passing reg. And if you're interested in TCP, potentially passing the TCP portion of the reg or of the CPA exam. So just to go back in time, just to give you an idea of how strong the demand for tax careers have been. If we flash back to 2018, we have this Wall Street Journal headline, Trump tax law spurs job creation, ... for tax lawyers and accountants. Business is unusually strong. It should remain robust for years as a result of the law, executives say. Here we got a little joke from the Wall Street Journal. Tax reporter. The joke I heard is that some people are calling it the Tax Jobs and Cuts Act. All right. I see we got a question in the chat. Doesn't look too promising for my teaching so far. Are we required to attend all the live sessions? It is absolutely required. You will be tested on the material from the live sessions. So something gets covered in the live session, it's going to be potentially on the quiz, on the final exam, but I'll try to spice up my teaching a little bit so it doesn't seem so rough. But definitely everything in the live session is going to be potentially testable. You don't have to attend live. You could watch the recording. So you don't necessarily have to attend at the time of the live session, but you do have to watch the recording at some point before you take the related material. Now, of course, if you don't watch the recording, doesn't mean you're not going to pass because we don't track attendance, but it does mean that you may encounter a question that you haven't seen before. And then when we get back to tax as a good career option, we also have very robust growth among the public accounting firms. You know, despite whatever doom and gloom you may hear about public accounting, it is, harder to attract talent now, but the accounting firms are doing very well in terms of revenue growth. Here we look at the top 100 accounting firms, and from Accounting Today, the firms in the Accounting Today's top 100 firms roster of the largest practices in the country reported that the revenues grew by 12.88% in 2023, the second highest rate in a decade, and it was only second to what it did the prior year in 2022. Here we got how many firms in the top 100 had growth rates in excess of 20%. So last year, 43 out of 100 firms had growth rates in excess of 20%. The year before that, over half of the top 100 had growth rates in excess of 100%. Just a couple of years ago, the last year Glassdoor did this Best Jobs in America list. They don't do it anymore. But just a couple of years ago, Glassdoor had tax manager as the 26th best job in America. The year before that, it was ranked even a little bit higher. And tax accountant was also on the list. I think the only accounting-related job to make the Glassdoor list. And of course, as we've talked about, tax is a very secure field because anytime tax law changes, life just gets better for tax accountants because there's more demand for their services. So Benjamin Franklin classically said, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. And Will Rogers, early 20th century comedian, had a nice little twist on this, which I think is relevant to the tax professional. The only difference between death and taxes is that death doesn't get worse every time Congress meets. And while for the average taxpayer, Congress meeting may result in more complexity, sometimes they lower rates, at least in the last 20 years, often Congress has lowered rates, but they introduce more complexity. But complexity, while that might be not so exciting to the taxpayer, it's pretty good for us, the tax professional. So, Margaret, I'm sorry, I've been teaching with Danielle for the last 3 years. I might occasionally accidentally call Margaret Danielle. So, Margaret, what do you think about tax as a career option?
Oh, I think it's a great option and a very secure one. As Benjamin Franklin said, death and taxes. We're always going to have taxes one way or another. So there are plenty of things to do with taxes. So I highly recommend it. And it's very interesting once you get into it.
Yeah. All right. So with all that out of the way, we're going to segue into our next topic, the much less exciting materials and syllabus topic. Any questions in the chat? I see we got a question about any thoughts on accounting firms changing to private equity. Maybe post in the discussion board if you want to talk about that. That might take us a little bit off the rails here. Are there good opportunities for career changes in tax? And I think yes, there definitely is, because there's so many different types of taxpayers that need tax services. First off, within tax, there are so many different fields you could go into. You could be someone that just does normal federal tax consulting and compliance. You could work in a group that maybe focuses on state and local tax consulting and compliance. You could work in a specialized field where maybe you focus in on just one type of tax issue. Maybe you work exclusively on research and experimentation tax credits, or maybe you work exclusively on depreciation issues like cost segregation studies. You could work in international tax, which even there are groups like regular international tax consulting and compliance, and then transfer pricing, which does nothing but try to figure out what price should related companies charge when they engage in a cross-border transaction. And even with all the different kinds of tax you can do, there are different places that you can do it. You could work in a public accounting firm. You could work for a private company in their internal tax group, or you could work for a government agency that enforces and administers the tax code, whether that's the Internal Revenue Service at the federal level or a state revenue agency. And the IRS, who for many years was sort of starved of funding. You guys may remember the so-called Tea Party exempt organization scandal from circa 2010-ish, 2011-ish. After that, Congress sort of starved funding from the IRS. So they were really short-handed, they were really underfunded. And then recently, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, they got sort of a lump of funds to bring their budget not over and above anything they've had in the past, but to bring their budget up to a level that's more comparable to what they had in the past. And with that, the IRS has done a lot of hiring of tax professionals. So there's definitely lots of opportunity, whether it's in public accounting, whether it's with private companies, whether it's with a government agency, and there's lots of different kinds of taxes that you can do. So I think lots of career opportunities. All right. So now let's talk about materials. So there is no required textbook for this course. There is no required textbook. In lieu of a textbook, we're going to have a voluminous amount of slides. I'm going to post articles on to Canvas. There are some articles on Coursera that are part of the sort of public-facing free version of the course. Check those out as well. But the important articles, the important readings, we're going to post in Canvas. I also like podcasts. There's nothing more exciting than just listening to a tax podcast while you're doing stuff around the house like laundry. So no required textbook, but I'm going to post lots of materials that are all going to be free to you. They may be under a paywall, but you have access to them either as a Geese student or through the university library. So you may have to use VPN, create a login, but no required textbook. Everything you need for the course, slides, readings, will all be freely available to you. They'll be posted mainly in Canvas. That's where the most important readings are going to be. And they're going to come from all kinds of sources, as you can see. But even though there is no required textbook, I understand that some students like textbooks. They like to just open a book and it says chapter 1, what is a tax? And they just go through all the stuff that we talk about in tax in class. So if you like textbooks, here is an optional, and I say optional supplement that I would recommend that you pick up. Of course, I don't get any kickback for this. This is just the book that I picked because I think it's pretty well written and it's cheap. I'm not going to lie to you. Textbooks are pretty outrageous nowadays. So I like this one because it is $46 for the ebook version. Now, this is Understanding Federal Income Taxation, 7th edition. Now, tax laws change constantly. Please don't get an older edition. The 6th edition has a lot of stuff that's out of date. The 5th edition, if you read that, you will probably be worse off than if you'd never opened the book at all, because that's before we had a bunch of TCJA changes. So if you're going to get the book, make sure you get the 7th edition and only the 7th edition. Don't be tempted by some used Amazon seller selling the 5th edition for $1. Don't do it. So this book is designed for law students that are taking a federal income tax course for the very first time that know nothing about taxes. And roughly, that's pretty similar to what we're trying to do here. So it fits into our graduate accounting tax education. The only maybe downside of this textbook from the accounting student perspective is it probably talks about cases more than what we're going to talk about in this course. Of course, we're going to talk about the big Supreme Court cases. This book probably talks about a few more than just those. But I like it for $46 if you like textbooks or if you just want to be a tax person. I would highly recommend picking this up. If you're just taking this because it's required and you want to pass, probably don't need to get this unless you really enjoy textbooks. And to make it easier to use this, I will post suggested readings on Canvas that match up with what we're doing in a particular module. So you don't have to sort of guess what parts of the book to read. If you do pick up the book, it'll work for Part A and Part B as well. So you'd only have to purchase one book for both 8 weeks. Margaret, do we need to catch up on any questions?
Yes, we have someone asking about any recommended podcasts for tax topics. Do you have any that you regularly listen to or follow?
I have a ton that I listen to and I follow. You're going to hear about them when I post them as required material during the course. Post in the discussion board, or Margaret, you can remind me to post in the discussion board. I'll give you guys a sampling of some of the ones I listen to.
Great. And we had a question asking about the slides for live session. They are posted already on Canvas on the live session page. And Matt, just to confirm, you post them after the live sessions so that they have your notes on them when you do add notes, right?
No. So I post them the night before. And typically, I do not post them with my scribbles. If there's ever a day where I write out something very beautifully, if I think it's a work of art, I might have Margaret screenshot it and we can add it to the slide list. But typically, I just post them the night before and that's it. Now, if there's, for example, a problem we work on in class and I don't want to give you the answer because that's kind of anticlimactic, maybe we'll follow up with the answer afterwards. But typically, I'm just going to post them the night before and then that's it. Unless there's a typo, unless there's a correction, which oftentimes there may be. Probably not going to have any post live session content.
Okay, great. And Maria's posted a chart showing how much the textbook costs have risen in the last couple decades. And it looks like quite a bit, about 812% or something. So I highly recommend this textbook if you like textbooks because it is easy to read and it does help with the material in this class. But it's not nearly as expensive as some of the textbooks are.
Yeah, and if you're on the fence, I think if you go to Amazon, you can read the first chapter for free. And again, I don't get any kickback. It's completely up to you whether you want this or not. Again, if you like textbooks, I'd get it for $46. And if you really just like tax, I'd get it because it has a lot of interesting tax content that goes over and above what we talk about on Coursera and in the live sessions. And speaking of book prices, just, I think, 3 years ago, the prior version of this book was only $42, and now it's up to $46. So a little bit of inflation there. All right, so I see we got one more question. Any advice on how we can receive tax updates and revisions via email? Yes, you'll want to sign up for tax notes, which it's important, I guess, we talk about it right now because during this course, we're going to have some assigned readings from tax notes. So tax notes is a great database that it has some research tools, but it's mostly a thoughts, commentary, explanation, article type website. And we're going to have some readings from tax notes, I imagine. And there's instructions in the syllabus for how to sign up for tax notes. But in addition to just having, commentary and explanations and articles, tax notes also has reporters that report on breaking tax news. And once you set up in your account in tax notes, you can sign up for email alerts that send you emails when there's breaking tax news, when there are new editions of tax notes that are published with articles, commentary, etc. And you can sort of set how often you want to receive these emails and on what topics you want to receive them. So you could receive multiple tax notes alerts every day. Maybe that's overkill. You could set it so you just get one federal tax notes email once a week. So I'd highly recommend that. So once you set up your tax notes account, go fiddle around with email alerts. And I think typically in the past, students have had trouble signing up for tax notes because it's a little convoluted. The syllabus explains it, but you have to log in via VPN, go to tax notes, and then set up a username and password. Once you set up the username and password, you never have to do the VPN again. But the first time you sign up for tax notes, you got to do that username and password. So, Margaret, give me a reminder to post some stuff on the discussion board about tax notes, about the email alerts, and just a reminder on sign-up tips. All right, so getting back to the syllabus, there's basically two portions of this course. We have the Coursera portion, which is the foundational course. That's where most of the lectures are, along with some other stuff. It's going to be video lectures, some readings, and some knowledge checks. There are readings in Coursera. I'm just going to tell you that in Canvas are going to be the most important readings. In Coursera, the readings, well, they could be useful or helpful. They're not quite as exciting because on Coursera, I'm limited to what I can put as a reading because it has to be freely available to everyone. In Canvas, I can give you guys readings that you can get as a University of Illinois student, so we can get a little bit higher quality content. So the Canvas readings, those are the most important readings. In each Coursera module, so we have 8 modules throughout our 8 weeks together, 1 module each week. At the end of each module, there is a pass-fail quiz. You can take it as many times as you need to in order to pass it. Your score doesn't factor into your grade as long as you pass. You just have to pass all these module quizzes. And technically, you just have to pass them by the end of the 8 weeks, although I would recommend keeping up with Coursera as we go through the course. So pass week 1 during week 1, pass week 2 during week 2, etc. And then in module 8, there's no pass-fail quiz. Instead, you have to complete a pretty basic tax return. And then you're going to take a quiz on that pretty basic tax return, typing in what the numbers on the return should be. And this is a pretty basic tax return. You guys shouldn't have any trouble with that. But in Coursera, you have to pass. Doesn't matter what your percent is, as long as it's above the pass threshold, you have to pass in order to pass the course. If you don't pass Coursera, you get an F for this course, no matter how good all your other scores are. Now, for the Canvas portion of the course, this is where the stuff that you do is going to factor into what your actual letter grade is, whether that's an A or a B. So the components in Canvas, we're going to have graded quizzes for modules 1 through 7. Now, these graded quizzes are in addition to the Coursera quiz. So remember, each week you got a Coursera quiz, and then you have the Canvas quiz. The Coursera quiz, it doesn't really matter when you take it, as long as you pass it by the end of the 8 weeks. The Canvas quiz is going to have a hard deadline by the end of the day on Sunday. The Coursera quiz, you can take as many times as you want. The Canvas quiz, you can only take once. So Canvas quiz, important, graded, like a very real assessment. Now, these 7 quizzes in Canvas are going to be worth 8% each. And your lowest score is going to be dropped. It's going to be 8% each, and your lowest score is going to be dropped. So if you just do bad on one quiz, no worries, it gets dropped. If you forget to take a quiz, no worries, lowest score dropped. Just don't forget to take another one. I see we got a question. You guys can tell from the preview, the quiz is not open yet because the graded quizzes don't open until after the evening live session. But I see we got a question. The Module 1 quiz on Canvas is one question. Any tips or preview for this quiz? And the reason the Module 1 quiz is one question is that I have not written it yet. So there's one question that I typed in as a placeholder. I haven't written the rest of the questions. Typically, these are going to be 8 to 12 questions, depending on how lengthy a question is to complete. I write questions new every semester. So every question you see is brand spanking new, never been seen before, because, I don't want you guys to accidentally come across a prior quiz on something like Chegg or Course Hero or anything like that. I want to spare you the temptation for looking at something like that. Now, what happens to all the old quiz questions? They all go into the practice questions pool, and you'll see that for each module, there is a ton of practice questions, and all those practice questions came from prior quizzes. And we'll talk about practice questions here in a bit. In addition to the graded quizzes in Canvas, which 8 to 12 questions due at the end of the day on Sunday. In addition to that, we have the group project, which is worth 15% of your grade. We'll talk about that more once we get to it. The individual tax return project, where you prepare your own 1040 individually, no group, 12% of your grade. And then the final exam's worth 25% of your grade. So the graded quizzes, they're going to be available after the Tuesday night live session. This way, I don't accidentally say something about the quiz that may be helpful in one live session or the other. We're just going to post them after the Tuesday night live session. So they're going to be available starting at roughly 8 p.m. on Tuesdays, and then they're going to be due at the end of the day on Sunday nights. Late submissions are accepted within 24 hours with a 25% penalty. There's one per module in modules 1 through 7. You get one attempt allowed, and there's a 30-minute time limit. The quiz for week 1, I haven't written it yet, but I can assure you, because it's week 1, it is going to be fairly straightforward, fairly easy. So don't stress too much about the module 1. You should still, of course, learn everything and watch all the videos. But the module 1 graded quiz in Canvas is going to be intentionally on the easier side. Very straightforward. The difficulty might start to ramp up a little bit starting next week, but module 1 is just going to hopefully ease us in to our semester together. The questions on the quizzes are going to generally only relate to the topic that we talked about during that week. Now, there may be some topics where we talk about them over 2 weeks and they could appear on either quiz, but generally the quizzes are only going to test things that we talk about during that current week. The final exam at the end of the 8 weeks is going to be cumulative, it's going to test everything. And again, the graded quizzes in Canvas only get one attempt. The group project, you're going to get assigned groups fairly soon. I'm not exactly sure when, probably sometime next week. The group project focuses on tax research, writing, and presenting to multiple audiences. I don't know exactly what we're going to do for the group project yet because I haven't written it. But once we write it, we'll talk a little bit more about what it entails. Typically, it involves, here's a client, they have a tax problem, and then you either have to write a memo, maybe to your partner boss about their tax issues. Maybe they have a notice and you have to respond to the IRS. Maybe you have to give them a presentation about different options. It'll be something along those lines. The group project is going to be posted around the start of Module 4, and it's going to be due at the end of Module 7. I see we got the next question. Do you expect during the ramp up in complexity that we may be butting up against the time limit, or is the time considered generous? The 30 minutes time is not going to be not going to be a problem. If there is a test that requires longer, I would increase the time limitation. I would say that if you're nervous about the quiz, go look at the practice questions, because those are literally 50 or 60 questions from prior semesters that you can use to get a gauge on what kind of questions to expect. And you'll see there's a mix of pretty basic to a couple tricky ones, but the practice questions are your friends. Margaret, thoughts on quizzes?
I agree with what Matt said. You'll have time during that 30 minutes to complete the quiz. My suggestion for studying would be go through Coursera, pay attention to the live session and all the readings, make sure you've gone through all of those. And then those practice questions, they are your friends. Go through them as many times as you want. They're there for you to practice. So when you're comfortable taking those, then you're ready for the quiz. And it'll be fine within that 30 minutes. You won't have an issue.
Yeah. And, you know, if you watch the Coursera videos, if you come to live sessions, if you do the practice questions, if you read the materials, it's going to be easy to get an A in this course. It is easy to get an A. I will say that if you don't do any of that stuff, it's also very easy to get a C or a D. But if you do all that stuff, easy to get an A. And if you're talking or if you're learning about this stuff and it's just not clicking, Margaret and I are here to help you. Post in the discussion board, send me an email, come visit us in office hours. We'd be glad to help you out. So then we got our next graded portion, which is 12% of your final grade, where you're going to have a hypothetical client that's going to come to you and they're going to want you to prepare their tax return. So here you're going to prepare an individual tax return. Now this tax return is in addition to the mini tax return you're going to do in Coursera. In Module 8 in Coursera, you're going to complete a super easy miniature-sized tax return in terms of the issues the client has. For the tax return project that we're doing for Canvas, you're going to have to do a little more work because the hypothetical client has a few more things going on. So I just want to stress, in Module 8, you have to prepare this mini tax return, which shouldn't take very much time at all. And in addition to that, you have to complete this tax return in Canvas that's going to be more complicated. So Margaret, how many tax returns do I need to prepare in week 8?
Oh, 2.
2.
You need to do the one in Coursera and then the one in Canvas, and they are different. So remember, 2 for week 8.
Yeah, I mean, the one in Coursera, you could just sort of write out the numbers and shorthand it on a piece of paper. The one we do in Canvas, you're going to be using actual tax forms, completing it, and then submitting it for grading. But it never fails. At least one student always forgets to submit the Canvas tax return, and they're like, oh, I thought I did that in Coursera. Just a reminder. The tax return project's available at the start of Module 5, and it's due at the end of Module 8. Now, a few questions about the tax return project to get out of the way. You're going to be putting numbers onto actual tax forms, and you're going to be doing this by hand. So there's no tax return preparation software that you need to buy or that you should buy. There is an Excel that you can use that's helpful, but no tax return preparation software is going to be used for this. Now you may be saying, well, I actually already have tax preparation software. I have TurboTax when I did my own taxes. Maybe I can just use that for the tax return project. And that is not going to work because instead of doing a 2023 tax return, we're going to be doing a 2024 tax return on draft forms that have not even been finalized yet. So no one has tax preparation software for 2024 yet, so you don't have to worry about that. Nice little trick we have, so TurboTax isn't too helpful. You can do it on TurboTax, but all the inflation-adjusted amounts are going to be wrong. Maybe that'd be helpful. You can compare and contrast, but it's not going to be the correct solution. And then, of course, we got the final exam, Module 8. The exam window is going to open on October 15th after the live session, and it's going to be available till the end of the day on Sunday at 11:59 p.m. One attempt is allowed. There's a 3-hour time limit. All quizzes and exams are open resource, but you cannot use the assistance of other humans. You cannot call up your classmates. You cannot text your classmates. You can't call up your CPA and say, hey, I got a hypothetical tax question. You can't have your tax attorney on retainer sending them emails. You can't post on Reddit. You cannot have the assistance of other humans. And that includes solution websites like Chegg, Course Hero. If a human posted something to one of those websites, like here's the question, here's the answer, can't use that. Margaret, is ChatGPT a human? Here's a question for you. You can't use humans on quizzes or final exams. Is ChatGPT a human?
It is not a human. However, it's also not always right when it comes to tax.
Yeah, so you can use generative AI on the final and the quizzes. Just remember, for essay questions, put things into your own words. Don't copy and paste solutions from ChatGPT. And you have to be thinking, oh, if he's going to let us use this stuff on the final, is it really that good? Something to think about. All right. For non-graded activities, and of course, I think ChatGPT is amazing and very helpful. You just have to know how to use it. You just have to know how to use it. All right. Non-graded activities, we got Canvas practice questions, which include prior year quiz questions from my classes, and we have participation in live sessions or discussion boards. None of that's graded. It's just all very helpful. And I think that's it. Thoughts, questions on assessment. Quiz scores will probably be, I see we got a question, are quiz scores shown instantly or after some time? We'll probably hide your quiz score until after the due date has passed. That way, there's less possibility of, foul play. Extra credit research studies, you'll have to check the syllabus for that information. The syllabus knows that better than I do.
I believe it's 1 hour of research credit, but again, check the syllabus.
All right. Live session schedule, good job. You guys made it here for our Tuesday morning 8:30 session, so you guys know that is when we do it on Tuesdays. We go till 10 a.m., so we got about 32 minutes left. And then we got Tuesday night, 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. These live sessions are going to be identical. We're going to cover the same content. We're going to have the same jokes. They're going to be identical as we can possibly make them. It's possible that one student may ask a good question in the evening session, and if that's the case, I'll try to post something in the discussion board so you early morning people don't miss out. One reason to make sure that you check the discussion board regularly. But other than that, they're going to be the same. If you can't make the live session live, just watch the recording. That is perfectly fine. There's no need to attend live. You can just watch the recording. I do enjoy seeing all you guys here so early in the morning, but if you can't make it, just watch the recording. Material from live sessions, as we discussed, will be tested. My office hours are going to be Wednesday from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. and Thursday from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. If these times don't work, just send me an email. I can absolutely work out an appointment if you need to talk about something outside of these hours, and that includes if you're only available in the evening, send me an email. We can work out an appointment. Margaret's office hours, Wednesday, 8:30 in the morning to 9:30, Thursday afternoon, 4 to 5. Margaret, thoughts on office hours?
Always happy to have you come and join office hours. Let me know if you have questions ahead of time. That helps me prepare. and let us know if those times don't work for you, or if you have something you want to be sure to talk to us individually about, like your grades or something. We can arrange a different time if need be.
Yeah, and feel free to come to office hours. A lot of students think, oh, it's a big course. There's a lot of students. If I come to office hours, it'll just be so crowded. The reality is, other than maybe final exam week and group project week, the reality is a lot of times I just sit there alone in Zoom by myself and no one comes. And it's kind of lonely, kind of sad. So feel free to come to office hours. They typically are not crowded, except when we got something big coming up, and we may add some bonus office hours for those kinds of things. I saw we had a question. Is the discussion board on Canvas or Coursera? The one we're going to use is on Canvas. Coursera has a discussion board. Please don't post anything there. I do not check it. Canvas, I'm going to check all the time. All right, so I think we have 29 minutes left to actually get in to some of the Module 1 material. But before we leave the syllabus and the course introduction, Margaret, did we miss anything? Was there something that I forgot to talk about?
I think you covered everything. It's a lot to cover, but I think you got it all.
All right. Any questions before we head in to our Module 1 material? Oh, I think we forgot to give you our backgrounds. Like, who are these people that are talking to us about tax? So my background is, a few years ago, I graduated from my undergraduate accounting program. I worked in a public accounting firm for 4 years. I did 2 years of just straight federal tax compliance and consulting. And then I did 2 years in specialized projects where I did things like private letter rulings, research and experimentation credit studies, cost segregation studies. And then after 4 years in public accounting, I went to law school so I could learn more about tax. And then after that, I worked as a tax controversy attorney. So I helped taxpayers that had disputes with the IRS, which included disputes with IRS exams, appeals within the IRS, the appeals unit, and then even tax court and district court kind of tax controversy. And now I'm at the University of Illinois, and this is I believe, my 8th academic year, here. I love it here. And this is my 7th year teaching ACCI 505. So the time just sort of flies by. And Margaret has been my co-pilot for 505. It's been a few years, but she was my co-pilot, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So Margaret, how did you get here?
Well, I got here via the program you're in, via IMSA. I started in the year they started the program back in, 2017, the fall of 2017. And once I graduated, I stayed on as a TA and kind of worked my way up slowly and worked with Matt for this class. Yeah, I think it was about 5 years ago, surprisingly. Goes fast. And I've worked with 501, 502, 507, 516. So I've worked with a lot of the courses and stayed on because I really enjoy the program and the students and all the professors that I've worked with. So that's how I ended up here.
Excellent. So I see we got some questions that came in. How much legal knowledge do CPAs need to know about tax without the need to go to law school? You don't need to go to law school, but you do need to understand the legal background for tax, which is what we're going to talk about in Module 1. And I see we got another question about the VPN for tax notes. If you're still having trouble with that, post in the discussion board. I can probably get some screenshots out. But without further ado, let's talk about Module 1. And we're going to sort of jump ahead and talk about probably the most dense, trickiest, complicated part of Module 1, which is sources of tax law. And sources of tax law are very important to CPAs working in tax. Because if your client comes to you and they want to know, is this gross income? Is this deductible? When is it gross income? When is it deductible? Am I eligible for this credit? how do you determine the answer? You have to look to the law. You have to look to the authorities. So let's start at the very beginning with the original power to tax in the Constitution. And a lot of what we're going to talk about right now is sort of a repeat of what's in Coursera with maybe a little bit more depth. And that's just because Module 1 is pretty dense. The live sessions sometimes are going to be repeats and expanding of what's in Coursera. Sometimes the live sessions are going to have completely new material that isn't in Coursera. So it's just going to depend a little bit about what's the topic for that week, what is it that we feel like we need to cover. But for this, we're just going to sort of give you a little bit of a more in-depth talk about that authority, that source of law stuff you find in Coursera. So, of course, the United States federal government is a government of limited powers, meaning they can only do what their governing document allows them to do. And the governing document for the federal government is, of course, the U.S. Constitution. So what does the U.S. Constitution say about taxes? Well, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes for the common defense, and we got this 1780 spelling of defense, for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. So we got this very broad taxing power right off the bat. But there's some limitations on this taxing power found elsewhere in the Constitution. So direct taxes. So something known as direct taxes, taxes that are direct taxes, shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included in this union according to their respective numbers, which means according to population. So direct taxes, we'll figure out what a direct tax is here in a second. Direct tax has to be apportioned based on state population. It's not on the slide, but taxes that are not direct taxes or indirect taxes, they just have to be uniform across the United States. So for example, a federal excise tax on gasoline is an indirect tax. It doesn't have to be apportioned based on population, but it has to be uniform across the United States, meaning you pay the same excise whether you're in Illinois or Texas. But direct taxes have to be divided up based on population. So keep that in mind as we're walking through our tax history. So the first income tax in the United States was imposed starting in 1861 to help finance the Civil War. So the tax, I think it was initially a flat rate of 3% on incomes above $800 bucks in 1861, quite a bit of money. The tax was later raised to a top rate of 10% on incomes over $10,000, which is almost $250,000 in today's dollars. This Civil War era income tax expired in 1872. Congress just let it expire because the need for funds wasn't necessary. Now, there was a taxpayer that paid the Civil War era income tax that did not like paying the Civil War era income tax. So they challenged the Civil War income tax and said, remember that clause in the Constitution that says direct taxes have to be divided up based on population? Well, I think the income tax is a direct tax. It should have been divided up based on population, and it wasn't. So it should have been unconstitutional. I should get the money back that I paid. And the Supreme Court said no. The income tax is not a direct tax. It is an indirect tax. It doesn't have to be divided up based on population. It is constitutional in a case called Springer versus United States, and that occurred in 1881. Now, one thing that you might notice is 1881 is quite a few years after the income tax ended in 1872. And that's pretty typical with litigation and tax litigation, that it takes quite a few years to work its way through the legal system. This taxpayer may have last paid tax in 72. They didn't get a final resolution until 9 years later in 81. So Civil War era income tax upheld as constitutional. Then in 1894, Congress enacted another individual income tax. They enacted another individual income tax. But this time, the Supreme Court, who had a dramatically different makeup than what they did a couple decades earlier, said, now we think this income tax is a direct tax. And because the income tax is a direct tax, it has to be divided up among all the states based on population, which it wasn't. So therefore, Supreme Court in 1894 in Pollock said the income tax was unconstitutional. Now, what does it mean for a direct tax to be apportioned based on population? So let's just do a little example here with our stick figure friends. So let's say it's after Pollock, and we know that an income tax, according to the Supreme Court, is a direct tax that has to be divided up based on population. And let's say the federal government needs to raise $10 in revenues, and there are two states in the United States. There's state A and there's state B. And in state A, let's do a little census here, the population is 2. And in state B, the population is 2. So if the federal government needed to raise $10 in revenue, and they had to do it based on population of the states, well, 2/4 of the United States lives here, 2/4 lives here. So that means 50% of that $10 has to be collected by state A. And then 50% of that $10 has to be collected by state B. So $5 needs to be collected in state A, $5 needs to be collected in state B. Sounds great, right? But what is the problem with an income tax design that looks like this? Well, let's look at the income of our citizens of state A compared to our citizens of state B. In state A, we have income of $50 each, but in state B, the income is $100 each. So what does that mean if state A has to collect the same amount of tax as state B because they have the same level of population? Margaret, what does this mean?
It means state A will be paying more based on their income. So they're going to be paying a higher rate of tax than the people in state B.
Exactly. Because this state A person has to pay $2.50 of tax on $50 of income. That's a 5% rate. But this person in state B has to pay $2.50 of tax based on $100 of income. That's a 2.5% rate. So while it's possible an income tax could be apportioned based on population, it's not very practical because you would have taxpayers in different states paying different rates on their income just based on state population. So not very practical. Congress did not want to go this route with trying to apportion an income tax. Now, what do we know is another type of direct tax? So property taxes are direct taxes. And the United States, believe it or not, has had a federal property tax that was apportioned based on state population. Although it's been a few years since they've done that. That was 1790, late 1790s, I don't remember the exact date, 1797, 1798, 1799. There was a federal property tax divided up based on population to pay for the quasi-war with France. Margaret can do fact checking and tell me the exact date on that. So Congress didn't want to divide up based on population, so they wanted to have an income tax, and they wanted it to be constitutional, and they didn't want to deal with this population stuff. So, believe it or not, at this time, there was broad bipartisan support for an income tax. The Democratic Party wanted an income tax, and most of the Republican Party, the progressive and populist wing of the Republican Party, wanted an income tax, including the Republican president at the time, William Howard Taft. So he talked about how the Supreme Court, we talk about this in Coursera, so I won't read it verbatim, but he said the Supreme Court messed up and they made a mistake. The national government should have the power to tax income without looking to population. So he proposed to Congress that we change the Constitution so we can have an income tax. Now, in this class, we're going to learn a lot about tax, which is very important, but it's also important that we learn general bar trivia because that is a very useful life skill. So we got a bonus question. What other high government office did William Howard Taft hold? He was president of the United States, but what else? What else did he do? Looks like Adam's on top of it with the answer.
Frequent bar trivia player myself. But William Howard Taft was the only president to also serve on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, exactly. He was on the Supreme Court, not just on the Supreme Court. He was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So pretty important fact.
Can I hit you with one more super quickly?
Sure.
John Quincy Adams, only president to return to Congress after being president.
Yes, excellent trivia. I think there's actually a movie about his return to Congress when he represented Armistead, 90s movie about his time after the presidency. All right, so we got this out of the way. Oh, clicker appears to have unclicked. So Taft said, Congress, we need to send an income tax amendment to the states to overturn this prior Supreme Court case. Additionally, at the same time, the Supreme Court composition had changed quite a bit since 1894. It was a more favorable Supreme Court towards taxation. So simultaneous with kicking the tires on an income tax amendment, in 1909, Congress enacted a corporate income tax. But because income taxes weren't exactly constitutional because of the apportionment issue, and it didn't make sense to apportion an income tax, in 1909, Congress said, well, we're going to have a corporate income tax, but we're going to be pretty clever. We're going to say it's not an income tax. We're going to say it's an excise tax because those don't have to be divided up based on population. And we're going to say it's an excise tax upon the privilege of doing business. So this excise tax on corporations was imposed at a rate of 1% on corporate incomes above $5,000. So it was an excise tax measured based on income. The Supreme Court, in a case called Flint versus Stone Tracy Company, said this was constitutional because it was an excise tax. Sure, it was an income tax, but it really was an excise tax on corporations. And interestingly, to this day, the corporate income tax, in a constitutional sense, is an excise tax and not an income tax. Another little interesting note, corporate tax returns were originally public. Of course, today, tax returns are highly confidential. The only tax returns you can see would be exempt entities. But in 1909, Congress thought, well, anybody should be able to look at anyone's tax return. So you could go down to the local predecessor to the IRS office and say, hey, I want to take a look at Standard Oil's tax return, and then they just give it to you, which is pretty fun. So Congress sent a constitutional amendment to the state to change the Constitution to override the Supreme Court in Pollock, and the states ratified it. And this became the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and it tells us that the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived among the several states without apportionment and without regard to any census or enumeration. So the 16th Amendment came in, it overruled Pollock, and it said income taxes do not have to be divided up based on population. And Congress quickly took this opportunity to enact the modern income tax that we still have today in 1913. Now, when they first enacted the income tax in 1913, it was just a law. And then they passed some more laws. And eventually all these laws sort of got a little complicated to keep track of. So eventually they were codified into a single book known as the Internal Revenue Code. And if we look at this picture of some Congress folk, these two top books right here are the Internal Revenue Code, at least as of a few years ago. So the Internal Revenue Code is the codification of all of the tax laws of the United States. Passed by Congress, written by Congress, passed by Congress, signed into law by the president. Now, the Internal Revenue Code is basically the highest authority when it comes to taxation, because the only thing more authoritative than the Internal Revenue Code is the Constitution. So as long as a code provision is not unconstitutional, the Internal Revenue Code is the most authoritative source of authority. We are using the Internal Revenue Code in 1986. That of 1986 part doesn't really mean anything. That was just the last time they changed up the table of contents. But we're using the Internal Revenue Code of 1986. Now, when we're talking about the Internal Revenue Code, you're going to see that within the Internal Revenue Code, there are subtitles and there are parts and subparts. But generally, when we're first starting to think about the Internal Revenue Code, we're going to think about it section by section. So if we're pointing to a particular provision, a particular law, we're going to say section and then give the number. So for example, here we have section 911, which is an exemption for certain foreign income. We're not going to talk about section 911 in this class, but it's a nice graphic. But if I wanted to point you to the law that says that some individuals can exempt some of their foreign earned income, I would say go look at section 911. Now, because section 911 is kind of big, if I wanted to give you more guidance on where to go look for a particular sentence or a particular paragraph, I wouldn't just tell you section 911. I would tell you section 911B, and I would give you the subsection. Or if I wanted to point you even further, I could give you the paragraph, the subparagraph, and then there's things like examples, clauses, etc. So in this class, you're going to hear a lot of references to code section and then a number. And that's where you're going to find the law as enacted by Congress that explains the provision that we're talking about. Now, probably the easiest way to look up Internal Revenue Code sections is if you just go to Google and you type in IRC space the code section you're looking for. The very first result is usually going to be from Cornell Law School. And they have a quick Internal Revenue Code you can easily access. And I would try that, go to a code section, and then once you're in the code section, maybe go to the navigation and back out of the code section. You can see, well, what subpart is this code section in? What part is this code section in? What subtitle is this code section in? And play around with the table of contents. Now, if you're actually doing research and you want more than just the text, maybe you want an explanation of the code provision, then you would use some of these tax research services we're going to talk about later in the semester, like Bloomberg, like CCH, like Checkpoint. So how does something become part of the Internal Revenue Code? So I would say, the quickest way to understand this is just go to YouTube and type in "I'm just a bill." There'll be a little cartoon that'll explain everything that you need to know. But the basic idea is that both the House of Representatives and the Senate have to pass the exact same text. Now, generally, tax bills start in committees. And in the House, the Ways and Means Committee is where tax legislation starts. And then the Senate is the Senate Finance Committee. But the basic idea is both the House and the Senate have to pass the exact same language. And then the president signs that into law, or the president can veto it. And then Congress can either override the veto and it becomes part of the Internal Revenue Code, or they fail to override the veto and the legislation just dies. But go to YouTube, type in "I'm just a bill" from Schoolhouse Rocks, everything you need to know pretty much. So when we think about sources of authority, we have the Constitution, highest authority on tax, doesn't say a whole lot about it though. We have the Internal Revenue Code, where Congress has taken the authority to lay taxes from the Constitution and passed tons and tons of guidance. And in the Internal Revenue Code, it's thick because there are so many different tax provisions So what is income? What is not income? What is deductible? What is not deductible? Timing. And there's just so many situations. A law gets passed. Taxpayers try to exploit the law by finding legal loopholes. Congress closes the loophole by enacting additional text. We end up with a pretty thick Internal Revenue Code because taxes are complicated because life is complicated. But even though the Internal Revenue Code is pretty thick, it is not enough to answer all the different types of situations that taxpayers may encounter. So we have to look to the other branches of government to help fill in the gap and enforce the Internal Revenue Code and administer the Internal Revenue Code. And the three branches of government, flash back to your high school government class. We have the legislative branch, which is Congress, which is the House and the Senate. They write the bills that become law. We have the executive branch, which is the President of the United States, his cabinet secretaries or her cabinet secretaries, and then all of the agencies under. Now, when it comes to tax, it goes President, Secretary of Treasury, and the Department of Treasury. And then within the Department of Treasury, we have the Internal Revenue Service, which is an agency in the Department of Treasury. Now, the executive branch is going to put out additional guidance. We're going to talk about it in a minute. They're going to administer the tax code and enforce the tax code. But sometimes taxpayers and the IRS have disputes about the tax laws, and those go to the judicial branch to be resolved. So maybe you disagree with what the IRS says that you owe, you go to a court in order for a judge or potentially a jury to resolve the dispute. So let's talk about the IRS. The IRS, as we know, is an agency within the Department of Treasury, so they are part of the executive branch. They are responsible for administering and enforcing the tax laws of the United States. They collect the money for the United States to operate. So in fiscal year 2022, the IRS collected over $4 trillion in revenue and processed 271 million tax returns across all different tax types, and their budget was $16 billion. So, for $16 billion, they're collecting over $4 trillion in revenue and processing 271 million tax returns. Now, who's in charge of the IRS? So Danny Werfel is currently the Commissioner of Internal Revenue. Danny Werfel is not a former college quarterback, just has a similar name. He is the Commissioner of Internal Revenue. And then Janet Yellen is the Secretary of Treasury, so Danny Werfel's boss. Now, we only got 3 minutes left, so this is probably a good a place as any to stop, and maybe we can pick up here on Thursday. Not Thursday, next week. I'm so confused. We'll pick up here next week. But of course, we do talk a bit about Treasury regulations and Coursera. So just because we're stopping here in the live session, you still got to know all the stuff from Coursera as well. Questions, Margaret, that we missed over the last few minutes?
There is a question about the average time for a tax bill to become law. Is it months or years? And
it completely varies. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act legislation went from introduced to signed into law over the span of just barely over a couple of months, which was incredibly fast for any piece of legislation. On the other hand, you have pieces of tax legislation that just sort of languish and nothing happens until maybe they catch a ride with another piece of legislation and then they get passed. So for example, there was a big bipartisan tax bill that passed the House of Representatives many, many months ago, and I think maybe February, and it's sort of just languishing in the Senate. And it's probably going to die there, but it may not. It may attach itself to something and get passed this fall, which would be less than ideal for some of our course content. But it just varies. It could be anywhere from, days, weeks, months to it just languishes the entire congressional session. Of course, it can't take longer than the session, of course, something could get reintroduced. Module 1 quiz includes everything that is in Coursera and everything we talked about today. Everything is fair game. If it comes out of my mouth, it could be on the quiz. Any other final parting thoughts, Margaret?
No, just keep up with Coursera and Canvas and all the readings and practice those, go through the practice quizzes and you'll do very well.
Yep. And if you have any questions we missed since we're out of time, post them in the discussion board. We'd be more than happy to engage with you. And that's it. We're out of time. I will see you guys next week. Thank you for joining us so early in the morning.